Hello guys, tonight we're heading deep into the jungle, not just any jungle, but the wild, steaming, tangled forests of 16th century Brazil, where parrots shriek and the canopy fires crackle near riverbanks, and an unlucky European prisoner named Hans Staden stares death in the face again and again. This is not a story of heroes or saints. It's a story of survival, of confusion, of silence, of language, barriers and salt air, and the strange heartbeat of another world. Hans was a soldier, a sailor, and eventually a captive, a guest, a ghost, and somehow a witness. He lived among the Tupin people for 9 long months, and while many feared them, called them cannibals, called them savages, Hans saw more fear, yes, but also kindness, meaning rhythm, gods of the forest that listen more than the heavens ever did. So before you get cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. I would love to know that. Now let's ease into tonight's journey together. The coast that should have been Safa. There was a stretch of the Brazilian coast where the waves came in like long, deliberate sighs, quiet, steady, and full of warmed promise to the men aboard the battered caravel. This sight should have brought relief after weeks of drift. Along an unforgiving shoreline, that green strip of forest, thick as a wall and swaying gently in the sea wind, looked like salvation. It whispered of landfall, of food, of water that didn't taste like salt and rot. And for Hans Staden, the German gunner who had signed on with Portuguese, more out of desperation than loyalty, it looked like one more chance to survive just a little longer. It was the spring of 1557, or so he would later guess, long after calendars had stopped mattering. The plan, if one could call it that, had been simple: to trade supply, to make contact with allies along the coast. There were friendly tribes here, or so the captain claimed that, but friendly meant different things in these waters, and Staden knew better than to trust too easily. He had already served one shipwreck off the coast of Pernambuco. He had already seen what the tropics did to men, not just their skin and bones, but their minds. The jungle didn't kill with swords, it killed with stillness, with insects, with sickness, with silence. It waited still when the sails were lowered and the smaller boat launched toward shore. Hans volunteered to go with the landing party. There were 6 of them in the longboat, oars creaking, sun in their eyes. The shoreline grew nearer with each pull, palms leaning like lazy watchmen, and beyond them the thick and mapped wilderness of the interior. No houses, no fires, no signal, just nature and the hope that someone would step out from the trees and offer food and name a gesture of peace. But no one did. Instead, the silence broke with a scream, not from the forest, but from the water behind them. One of the sailors in the longboat dropped his oar, pointed back toward the sea. A second canoe, long and narrow, slid into view from behind a reef, then another, then 4 more. All were full of bodies, naked browns, skinned and painted in streaks of red and black. Feathers danced on their heads. Spears caught the sunlight like flares. The men rowed in silence, their expressions unreadable. That was the most terrifying part. There was no roar of fury, no cries of war, just the methodical rush off paddles, and the knowledge, sickening and immediate, that there would be no escape. Hans remembered grabbing for his knife, though he never used it. The longboat capsized before anyone could shout. He went under, salt thrashing, limbs burning, eyes, and when he surfaced again, it was to hands on his shoulders, yanking him up, tying his arms behind his back with wet cords that smelled of blood and seaweed. The other sailors, if any served, were not beside him. One he saw float face down in the foam, and a third screamed for his mother in a language Hans didn't recognize before being dragged backward by 2 men with blackened teeth. The coast was no longer safe. It was close. That was, they didn't kill him, not immediately. That fact alone was strange enough to settle like ice in his stomach. Was marched ashore barefoot, half blinded by sunlight and brine. The sand felt sharp, hot, alive with movement. Crabs scurried around his ankles, birds cawed overhead, strange and sharp, as if warning the forest what was coming. And then they entered the trees. It was like passing from one world to another. The jungle swallowed the light in an instant. It smelled of sap and wet leaves, of rot and fruit, of something deeper and unfamiliar that clung to Hans's throat and made him gag. The trees pressed in close. Their trunks, slick with moss vines, drooped like noose from above. Flies gathered on his skin the moment sweat began to rise. Still bound, he stumbled after his captors, one of them, the tallest with aired band painted across his brow, occasionally glanced back, not to check on Hans, but to smile. Not kindly, not cry, simply to acknowledge that Hans was still alive and that his life was no longer his own. He traveled for hours, maybe days. Time lost shape in the heat and greensome times. Hans was fed fruits. He didn't know the names of a strip of dried meat that might have been fish or monkey orman. He didn't ask. He chewed, because to refuse food was to show weakness, and wakeness in this place smelled like blood. Once they passed another group, a band of women carrying baskets, children clinging to their hips. The women stopped. They stared. One leaned forward and spat at Hans's feet. Another said something loud and reached out to tug a lock of his pale hair, as if testing whether it were real. Eventually, they reached the village. It was built on a rise near a wide, muddy river. The houses were round and low, made of thatch and wood. Smoke curled from several cooking fires. There were dogs, thin and watchful, and men sitting in circles, sharpening spears or wrapping cords. Hans was dragged to the center of the clearing, pushed to his knees and left. There a crowd formed slowly, children first, wide-eyed and silent, then the older women whispering, pointing finally, fewer ears and elders. No one touched him. Again no one spoke to him. They just watched, and Hans, still dripping from the river, still dizzy from fear and sunstroke, knelt beneath their gaze and tried not to weep. The coast, that green promise of rest and safety, had delivered him not to salvation, but to spectacle. He wasn't Amen anymore. He was a guest, a curiosity, a potential meal, or worse, a prophecy. He remembered hearing drums later that night, slow, rhythmic, like the sound of a distant heartbeat. Something was happening in the village. Something ceremonial, but he wasn't taken to it. Not yet. They let him sleep, if you could call it that. Curled on the packed dirt, tethered to a post, the stars above the clearing blinked in and out behind the smoke. In his dreams, he saw the coast again, but this time it wasn't sunlight that touched the waves. It was fire, and in the trees something was waiting, always waiting. The morning did not arrive gently. It arrived with a kick to the first chains. First words, ribs delivered by a bare foot caked in red clay. Hans jerked awake, the taste of blood in his mouth and smoke in his lungs. Around him, the village had already begun to stir. Chickens clucked from somewhere unseen. A thin dog nosed at an overturned pot. The sky overhead was a chalky gray, not yet warmed by sunlight, but already heavy with heat. He was still tied to the post. His wrists burned from the coarse fiber binding them, now swollen where the ropes had dug in during the night. His back ached. His tongue felt like leather, and his nose was crusted with dried salt and ash. But he was alive. That fact alone was no small miracle in a place where most prisoners were said to live no more than a few hours, long enough to amuse, long enough to bleed. A group of men approached. One of them was the tall warrior with the red-painted brow, the same who had smiled at him in the jungle. Now up close in daylight, Hans saw more clearly. That paint wasn't random. It was precise, ritualistic. The man's skin bore scars and patterns, ridges raised by careful cuts. Like a living tapestry of violence and honor. Around his neck hung a necklace of bones, some too small to be animal. He crouched in front of Hans, studying him with the slow confidence of some amazed to dominance. Then he spoke. It was a rush of syllables, sharp, nasal, rhythmic. Hans didn't understand. He blinked, tried to shake his head, but motion only made the pain in his temples pulse harder. The warrior repeated the words slower, this time almost patiently. Behind him, one of the other men chuckled. Hans rasped, his voice cracked. I don't understand. The warrior narrowed high sighs. A slap landed fast, flat palm, not brutal, but firm, a warning. Then the warrior stood and turned to the others. He spoke again, gesturing toward Hans with a lazy flick of his hand. Whatever said caused a ripple of low laughter. Someone mimed walking pointed at Hans, then at the forest. Another shook his head, made a chopping motion at his own neck, then laughed again. Hans didn't need to speak their language to know what was being baited, but he did need to speak, so he tried. He used the scraps of Tupi he had heard during his earlier travels, half-remembered words traded with coastal guides or shouted from canos. During tense negotiations, amigo, he muttered, branco migo non guerrero. The men paused. One repeated his words with exaggerated mockery, then spat into the dirt. Another, however, they just among them, tilted his head and said something back. It wasn't cruel, just confused, a question perhaps. Hence tried again a Maguini contraports, Portuguese that made them pause longer. He had learned this trick months ago, claiming to be against the Portuguese, claiming to be from somewhere, Reals, Germany, Flandre, anywhere that didn't have a flag planted in the soil. Tupinambá, his captors, were sworn enemies of the Portuguese settlers who had begun carving Brazil into plantations and missions. To say you hated the Portuguese was to claim distant kinship, a kind of utility. It wasn't always enough, but sometimes it bought time. The tall warrior studied him again. Crossed his eyes were narrow, not unkind, but calculating. Hans lowered his gaze. Submission to was a language. Then the warrior stepped as it ended. A new figure emerged from the watching crowd. She was older, perhaps 50, with hair in thick gray braids and skin like burnished leather. Her tunic was dyed in deep earth tones, and around her neck hung a gourd filled with tiny rattling seeds. Her feet were bare, her steps deliberate, and when she spoke the men fell silent. Her voice was soft, slow, deliberate. She didn't shout, she asked questions. Hans didn't know the words, but tone was unmistakable. Curious, skeptical, deliberate. She walked a slow circle around him, speaking as if to the air, to the bones under his skin, or the spirits she believed clung to him. Then she stopped and crouched before him without permission. She touched his thumb rough against his cheekbone. She studied his eyes, then she placed a hand flat on his chest right over his heartbeat, and listened. Hans didn't dare move. She said a single word, one syllable, then rose and walked away. Whatever judgment she had passed, it was final. The men lifted Hans roughly to his feet, untied the rope from the post, and dreided it around his neck like a leash. But they didn't drag him. They led him. That, too, was a message. He wasn't livestock yet, he wasn't meat, yet he was being evaluated, measured, weighed like a piece of game brought in from the forced awaiting inspection by the tribe. The next few hours blurred. He was taken to a hut, simple, low, thick, with smoke inside it. Was hot but cooler than the outside sun. Someone gave him water, thick and bitter. Someone else gave him food, a paste of mashed root, slightly fermented. He ate slowly under watchful eyes. Children came and went. One poked at his hair, another touched his boot. Asmal girl brought him a stick and placed it in his lap, then ran off giggling. No one spoke to him. Butavarian watched that night. Drums returned, not near the center of the village, but distant, out past the river. Hands listened, heartbeat slowing with rhythm, something ceremonial again, or maybe just nightly music. The Tupinambá lived close to the world of the spirits, and every sound seemed like a message to something unseen. He lay curled in the corner of the hut, untied but too exhausted to run. The old woman was somewhere nearby. He could hear her voice chanting or praying, or perhaps speaking to the fire. He thought of Germany, of iron church bells and snow-covered roofs of bread, but mostly he thought of the red-painted warrior and the strange half-smile that never left his face. Hans was still breathing, still intact, but each hour that passed felt like one more coil drawn tighter around him. Chains were looser now, but they were still there. The village was not large, but a village of drums and ice was alive in a way that made Hans uneasy. It pulsed like a single body, breathing, shifting, watching itself. The huts were arranged in a wide circle, their thatched roofs sloping low like huddled shoulders. Each one opened inward toward the heart of the village, a communal space where fires crackled, meat smoked on low racks, and the tribe's memory played out in footsteps and songs. Hans had expected chaos, shouting, violence, some daily echo of the terror he imagined cannibals would embody, but at Tupinambá were not chaotic. They were orderly, quiet in their routines. The silence they kept was not of peace, but of something older and more dangerous, like the silence of predators before a pounce, or priests before a ritual. Every hour he was there, he felt eyes, not just the obvious stares of children who pointed and whispered, answered each other to inch closer to the pale stranger, not just the warriors who glanced up from their repairs, spears resting across their knees. It was the older eyes, the women who sat weaving beside their huts, the elders who blinked. Slowly in the shadows, the men who leaned against trees pretending not to see him. These were eyes that judged, that measured, that placed him on some invisible scale at times. He was ignored, left Alanito sit on a mat beneath the shade of a bent palm. A bowl of water, a bit of dried fruit. No one chained him, no one struck him, but no one spoke to him either. At other times they invited him, if that was the word. He was brought to the communal fire, made to sit as the villagers told stories in a language Hestel did not understand. They passed around gourds of thick drink, and Hans, not wanting to offend, drank it. Tasted of smoke and fermentation. His head spun, the fire became too bright. The faces around him blurred into masks, and yet even through the fog the eyes remained. A child climbed onto his lap one night, maybe 5 years old, naked, except for a string of beads around her neck. She stared up at him and touched his beard with sticky fingers. She laughed and said something to the others. More laughter followed, and Hans smiled awkwardly. The child mimed something, biting, then rubbing her belly, and the crowd roared. Hans didn't understand, but did not laugh. That night he dreamt of being eaten, not in rage, not in pain, but slowly, reverently, by a circle of silent faces with eyes that never blinked. The next day he was taken to Thurver. 2 men gestured for him to follow. They didn't tie him, didn't guard him with weapons, just walked ahead expecting obedience. Hans followed past the outer huts, down a winding trail. The forest pressed close, its smell thick and green. Insects winded near his ears. The river was wide, slow, its waters brown, but not filthy. A woman stood waist deep, washing clothes with rhythmic slaps against a rock nearby. Children splashed, shrieking with laughter. One of them then handed Hans a clay bowl. He pointed toward the water, then to Hans' body. A bath for a moment. Hans stood there, dumbfounded. They were letting him bathe alone, unbound. He stepped into the water cautiously. It was cooler than expected, silty and smooth. He washed as best, heckled, scraping dried blood from his wrists, rubbing dirt from his legs, rinsing salt from his beard. The children floated nearer, curious. One boy threw a handful of water at Hans's chest and lawed. Another mimicked his motions, scrubbing his own arms with exaggerated fleur. Hans managed a weak smile. For a moment he felt not safe, but something near it. The water, the sun, the sounds of children. It was almost human, almost familiar. But when he stepped from the river and reached for his ragged tunic, it was gone. One of the men had taken it. Instead they handed him a strip of cloth woven and colored in dull reds and yellows to wrap around his waist. They were dressing him not as one of them, not truly, but as something that belonged here, back in the village. The transformation became more deliberate. His boots vanished. He was taught silently to eat with his fingers from shared bowls. His hair was tied back with a bit of vine. He was not a prisoner anymore. Not openly. He was not caged or tortured, but he was not free, was being shaped, recontextualized. Each night the drums returned. They were not always close, sometimes from a neighboring village, sometimes faint as a heartbeat through the hills, but always steady, always there. And each time Hans wondered if someone was being prepared, marinated, sung over, blessed, and devoured. He learned to listen for the silences between the drums. Those were war silences. Meant decision, meant preparation, meant the moment where they looked at each other and nodded wordlessly, like they had always known the time would come. He began to notice which villagers avoided him, which women left a space between them when he passed, which warriors looked at him longer than necessary. These were signs. He didn't know how to read them, but his body did. Every inch of his skin buzzed with animal instinct. Something was coming. The old woman still watched him. She didn't speak, but sometimes she would leave food nearby, not hand it to him. Just place it near where he sat, then walk away. She carried herbs, rattled seeds in her palm when she passed at night. Hans heard her singing or whispering just outside. His huv began to wonder if she was protecting him or preparing him in the quiet. Hours before dawn he would lie awake listening to the forest. The village slept, but the jungle did note it, hissed and chirped and rustled with life. Things moved out. Their eyes watched from beyond the firelight. Sometimes he thought he heard footsteps just past the trees. Other times he imagined his own voice calling out in German to no one at all. And once, just once, he thought he heard an answer. But when he stood and stepped into The dark, there was nothing, just the trees, just the eyes, just the drums beginning again, slow and steady, calling something ancient back into their clearing hands. Lay down again, eyes open, arms crossed, was no longer a prisoner in chains. He was part of the story, now part of the village, and the village was watching. It began with when a prisoner is a prophecy storm, not a storm in the sky, but in the village. Itself a boy had fallen ill enough. The chieftain's younger sons, it came on suddenly, as many things did in Thefrest. A fever that set his body, a flame followed by convulsions that rattled his limbs like bamboo and wind. The women tried roots, tried smokes, tried prayers whispered into gourds and sprinkled over the boy's chest, but the child's eyes rolled back, his breath came in gasps. People gathered, they didn't speak, but their faces carried the question like a thunderclouds. Why now? Hans was sitting outside his hut when the old woman appeared again. This time she didn't bring food or seeds. She pointed at him, then at the fire, then at the chief's hut. Her eyes did not blink. Two warriors approached. They didn't tie him, they didn't shout, they simply waited. Hands stood slowly, legs stiff and disused, throat dry with dread. He was being taken somewhere, and for the first time in weeks he was being taken for something. Inside the chief's hut the air was thick and metallic. Smoke clung to every surface. The child lay on a mat of oven grass, half covered in jaguar skin, his mouth open and dry. Around him knelt figures in ceremonial paint, some holding feathers, others singing low and broken. It's the chief himself, Tupinambá, a mountain of a man with skin like carved mahogany, stood silent, his gaze burning like coals. Hans was pushed forward. A murmur rippled through the crowd. One of the elders said something sharp, too fast for Hans to catch. Anna gestured toward the boy, and then to Hans, and then to the sky. That's when it came to him, not as a thought, but as a flicker of survival, an instinct buried deep and ancient. The Tupinambá were not fools, they were not beasts, they were people bound by something older than law, belief. This was a world of spirits, of omens, of signs, sent by ancestors and gods whose name she had never crossed European lips. If this child was ill, it was not only because of fever, it was because something had shifted in the balance. And Hans' hands was the unliving in this village that hadn't belonged. He took a step forward, not fast, not challenging. He lowered himself beside the boy, placed a hand gently on the child's chest, and closed his eyes. He didn't know what he was doing. He didn't need to. The ritual wasn't in the action, it was in the performance. And so he reached back into every church he'd ever sat in, every priestly motion he'd observed from the corner of his boyhood eye. He whispered in Latin, not prayer sexically, but pieces of liturgy, fragments of mass lines from the Psalms. The words meant nothing to these people, but the sound of them did. A woman gasped. Hans opened his eyes and raised his hand to the air, tracing a slow circle above the child's head. He muttered more, half prayer, half invocation, the syllables long and thick with mystery. The room had gone still. Cannibal leaned forward, hands pressed, 2 fingers to the boy's forehead. Then, without breaking the rhythm of his whispers, he reached forth bowl of herbs nearby, dipped his fingers, and touched them to his own brow, then to the boy's, then back again. A sacred loop, invented on the spot, an act without meaning but filled with meaning. Someone whispered the word Cannibal. Hans didn't know it at the time, but later, much later, he would understand. Cannibal, a term for a foreign shaman, a spirit man, a conduit, not just white, not just strange, but touched. Not all Kabas were believed, but all were feared. The boy began to breathe easier. It wasn't a miracle, the fever hadn't broken, but he twitched less. His chest rose and fell with more rhythm, and that was enough. The women exchanged glances. One began to chant, softly mirroring Hans's cadence. The others followed. When Hans finally stood, his knees were shaken. Cuny baby met his eyes, said nothing, and gestured toward the fire. Amen came forward and placed a necklace in Hans's hands, wooden beads bound with bone, a gift or a sign. Hans bowed his head. He had not healed the boy. This bove had become useful that night. The drums were louder. Hans sat alone outside his hut, necklace still clenched in his hand, wondering what he had just done. He had lied, yes, deceived them, woven a fabric of nonsense and pageantry from the threads of fear and faith. But was it a lie? If it saved him, if it gave the child another day, if it replaced chains with food and silence with a kind of sacred curiosity. He didn't know, but he did know this: a new role had been cast for him. He was no longer a prisoner to be eaten. He was a figure to be interpreted. Over the next days they came to him more often, asking things not in words, but in gestures. A man with a pain in his leg pointed, then mimed, and knife hands offered a paste made from crushed root and spit applied with ceremony and silence. Another woman, unable to conceive, brought him a bird feather and wept. Hans lit a bit of bark, wafted the smoke around her, and said words he hadn't spoken since childhood. In Cologne, to them, it was magic. To Hans, it was theater, but it worked. They gave him food now without hesitation. Children brought him carb trinkets. The old woman began to sit near him each evening, not speaking, just rattling seeds softly in her palm. Avanti warriors bowed their heads when they passed. Hans knew the truth would catch him eventually. No lie lasted forever. But he also knew that in a land where death could come in a whisper, in a vine, in a bite, or in a glance, belief was stronger than steel, and for now they believed in him. It was not a secret. The preparations began days before, slow, deliberate, and dancing around the fire pit without urgency. There was no hush, no hiding, no sense of guilt or shame. The villagers carried logs toward the clearing, stacked them with care, and began layering kindling and thick branches. At the center, women ground spices, aromatic, pungent, unfamiliar to Hans, but clinging to the air like ghosts of kitchens. He had never known men painted their faces with ochre and soot tracing, intricate patterns that shimmered when they sweated. The children practiced sentences, and all the while Hans watched. At first he thought it might be a festival. He had seen something similar once before, weeks earlier, singing, feasting, a great roaring fire that seemed more joy than menace. But this time there was no joy in the music, only rhythm, steady, exacting, and slow. He noticed the shift in atmosphere when they brought the man in. He was bound, of course, ankles lashed with fiber cords, wrists tied behind his back, but upright, alert. His head bled from a gash above the eye, but he walked under his own power. He was not one of them. His skin was lighter, his features failure Portuguese. He looked to be about Hans's age, maybe younger, thin sunburned, but still defiant. His eyes scanned the crowd like a man searching for proof that this was all a dream. The villagers did not jeer. They did not strike him. They sang. Hans had heard many kinds of singing in his life, choirs and cathedral loves, sea shanties sung half-drunk under creaking sails, women humming glubbies to babies that might never grow old. But he had never heard singing like this. It was deep, chest-driven, a kind of chant that pulsed like a second heartbeat. It didn't sound angry, it sounded hungry. The man was tied to a post at the center of the clearing. Just a few paces from the rising flames, smoke drifted around him, clinging to his skin, tracing the angles of his face. He said something softer, maybe a prayer, maybe a curse. No one responded. Hans felt himself drifting toward the edge of the circle. Not by choice, but because a hand had pressed to his back. Old woman was there again, gently steering him. He had been summoned to witness, not as a prisoner, not as egoist, as something else entirely. The dance began when the sun reached its lowest angle, when the light turned the edges of the forest to bronze, and the shadows grew long enough to blur the line between human and spirit. Warriors stepped into the firelight one by one, chanting, stamping the ground in patterns, circling the captive in loops that grew tighter, faster. Their faces were painted like skulls. Some carried clubs, others carried nothing at all. Hands could not look away. The air smelled of wood, smoke, and blood, and meat. The captive trembled. Now he had stopped praying. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. His knees bent slightly. Still he stood. Then, with a sound like a tree breaking in half, the first blow fell. It landed on the man's thigh, not lethal but brutal. He cried out, a high sound, sharp and human. Another blow came, and another, not all aimed to kill. Not yet. It was not punishment. It was ceremony. Hans's fingers dug into the skin of his arms. He was shaking, not from fear, not exactly from comprehension. He had known this was real. Of course he had. The stories had preceded him, tales of cannibal feasts, of victorious tribes honoring their enemies by consuming their strength. But stories were words. This was flesh. The man screamed again, then choked, then fell still. A warrior stepped forward, tall, graceful. His face half shadowed by sapphire light, he raised a blade carved from bone and shell. There was no rush nor frenzy. He knelt beside the body, placed a hand on the chest, and whispered something. Then the cutting began. Hands turned away, bile rising, but the old woman's hand remained on his shoulder, firm grounding. He understood then. With a clarity that hurt, he had been summoned to witness because this was his place. Now he could not be part of the tribe without seeing what the tribe was. The meat was taken in peacefully, respectfully. Some parts were wrapped in leaves, others placed directly onto hot stones near the edge of the fire. The smell changed, sharper, now grazy, disturbingly familiar. It mingled with the scent of spices. Children danced again, now with brighter faces, as if a story had reached its conclusion. When the pieces were done, they were passed first to the chief, then to the elders, then to the warriors who had drawn blood. It was not a feeding frenzy, it was communion. Hans was offered a piece not large, just a thin strip, singed at the edge, steaming slightly. The old woman held it out, palm open. Her face was unreadable. He stared at it. The smell reached him again, and this time it triggered memory. Roasted pork from his mother's hearth, the kind served during feast days in winter. Hegged, but he did not refuse. He took the strip, held it, then lowered it to his lap, pretended to eat, let it fall behind him. When no one looked, no one protested. The drums slowed, the fire sank low. One by one, the villagers drifted back to their huts. The ceremony complete. Hans remained seated long after the last song faded. The clearing was empty. Now only ash remained and bones. He had seen death before, war, sickness, shipwreck, but he had never seen ritualized consumption. Death performed not for punishment or survival, but as a translation of belief into action. They had not done it with cruel tithet, was the worst part. They had done it with reverence, as if they believed they were making themselves whole. And Hans, who had once thought himself clever for mimicking their faith, now understood the cost. Belief was a door once opened. You could not control what came through, and tonight something had walked through that fire. They said his name in a way that stopped conversation, even the children who ran the one they called Cannibal between huts and leapt barefoot through ash, lowered their voices when he passed. Cunum, not always said with fear, not always with reverence, but always with space, as if the name itself needed breathing room. Hans had seen him only at a distance until now. During his first days in the village, the chief had been a presence felt more than seen. A tall shadow near the largest fire, a deep voice giving brief commands that ended arguments before they began. He was a man while others orbited like fireflies circling an ember, never too close, never too bold. But after the fire pit, after the man's screams, and the ritual that followed, everything changed. Hans was summoned. It happened at midday, when the sun was highest and the village shimmered like a mirage. A boy barely 10 appeared at the door of Hans's hut, said nothing but pointed toward the great hut in the center. He didn't wait to see if Hans followed. Hans did. He passed other huts, past the place where the bones had been swept aside, past women weaving with downcast eyes. No one met his gaze. The village was always active, always humming, but today it moved like a stage set between acts, silent, waiting. The door to Cannib's dwelling was wide open inside. It was cool, and dark thick mats covered the floor. Spears leaned against the walls, not in racks, but arranged in spirals. Bones, some animal, some not, hung from the rafters on cords of twisted grass, swaying slightly in the breeze. And at the far end, seated cross-legged on a woven platform, was the man himself, Cannibal. He was massive, not just in size, but in gravity. His body, even in stillness, seemed to contain weight beyond flesh. His shoulders were broad-skinned, dark as soaked bark, chest painted in looping white sigils that pulsed with each breath. His hair was tied in tight rows around his neck, were strings of jaguar teeth and shards of polished shell that caught the light in sudden flashing bursts. He did not rise, he did not speak. Hands approached slowly, heart pounding against his ribs like it wanted to flee. He knelt not because he had been told to, but because it felt wrong to do anything else. Cannibal studied him and still said nothing. The silence stretched long, so long that Hans began to count his own breaths, began to wonder if this was part of a ritual or simply a test of endurance. His knees ached sweat, gathered at the base of his neck. Finally the chief lifted a hand, not quickly, not sharply, but like a tree raising a branch against wind. He pointed to a small bowl on the floor beside him. It was filled with paste, dark red, thick, smelling faintly of fruit and iron. Hans hesitated. Then he reached out, dipped 2 fingers in, and waited for a sign. Kund nodded, so Hans touched the paste to his own chest, mimicking the marks he had seen on others. They weren't precise, they didn't need to be. This wasn't art, it was allegiance. The chief said a single word. Hans didn't understand it, but he repeated it. Kunyub said it again, slower this time, more deliberate. Hans echoed it. Something shifted. The chief stood now slowly, his frame unfolding like a beast waking from slumber. He towered over Hans, but there was no threat in his stance, just assessment, like a farmer deciding if a tool would break under strain. He reached out one hand, not to strike, but to help Hans to his feet, and for the second time since landing on this unforgiving coast, Hans found himself lifted by hands that could have crushed him, but didn't. The rest of the village began to understand soon after. Hans was no longer simply a prisoner. He was not entirely a guest either. He was under Kunbi's eye, which was both protection and burden. He was summoned to more gatherings, now sat closer to the inner circle. Warriors nodded at him, some smiled, but none touched him. He saw more of Kunbi in the days that followed. The chief did not speak often, but when he did, others fell silent. He listened more than he ordered. He ate last, not first, and yet no one questioned his dominance. Hans watched him resolve disputes with a gesture, calm a frightened child with a glance, and Hans win. A panther killed a goat near the river with nothing but a spear, and his bare hands drive the beast back into the trees. There was no boasting, no drama, only presence. One evening near dusk, Kunbi approached Hans alone. They sat near a fire, the village fading into silhouettes around them. The chief held out a carved pipe, wood darkened with use, mouthpiece wrapped in soft bark. Hans took it, smoked, coughed, lawed. So did Kunam baby. They spoke no common language, but that night something else passed between them, a kind of truce, or maybe a shared understanding that belief, like leadership, was as much about perception as truth. And Hans, the foreigner who had spoken nonsense into a sick boy's skin and made it sound holy, was beginning to understand what it meant to be watched not as an outsider, but as a symbol. The question was, how long could a symbol stay sacred? And what happened when the village grew hungry? Days, measured by hunger and smuck again. Time no longer came in days, it came in fires. Each morning, the sky above the village turned pale and gold, and the smoke from the hearths began to rise, thin, at first like the stretch of a yanthan, fuller dark threads curling through the gaps in the thatch roofs, carrying the scent of scorched manio, dried fish, and sometimes something less recognizable, more bitter. Hans would sit cross-legged near the doorway of his hutarms, wrapped around his knees, and watch that smoke unravel like a slow language. Was still trying to learn. There were no clocks here, no bells, no market cries, no tolling from towers to mark the hour of prayer. Time was firelight, an ember, the sound of feet moving from shadow into sun. It was the moment a bowl of food was set before him, or the longer moment when none came. Hunger, like everything in the village, was ritualized. He was no longer starving, not in the violent, gnawing way of shipwrecks and salt sores, but his stomach rarely felt full. Meals came when the village shared them, and that meant, depending on the catch of the hunters, the size of the fishnet's yield, or the generosity of those who still viewed him with fascination, suspicion, or some strange blend. Off-buth breakfast, when it happened, was usually a mashed root, bitter and thick, texture of old paste, eaten with the fingers from a shared bowl. Sometimes it was flavored with ash or herbs, sometimes not. Occasionally, a sliver of meat, appered dried and thin as bark fish, if lucky lizard. If not once, something he suspected had too many fingers, but Hans ate not because he enjoyed it, not even because he needed to live, but because eating was part of being seen, part of performing the role that had for now kept him alive. The white spirit man, the foreigner who whispered to fire, he had become a kind of figure around the village, not loved, not hated, but watched. They were waiting for something. He wasn't sure what. Some days no one spoke to him at all. The warriors were out hunting. The women worked at their looms or pounded Grain with heavy rhythmic strikes. Children still hovered nearby sometimes, tossing pebbles or mimicking his accent and giggles. But mostly it was quiet, not peaceful quiet, just unmarked space. Hans took to walking in circles. He was allowed freedom of a kin, no guards, no chains, but there were boundaries invisible and absolute. Beyond huts lay the tree-line thick and humming with sound, and beyond the trees deeper jungle and death. Even the villagers rarely ventured far without reason. Those who did always went in groups. Painted preparazzo, Hans stayed in orbit, tracing the same slow loop each day, past the cooking fires, past the hut where the old woman lived, past the hollowed tree where someone hung feathers in bundles. Like warnings or prayers, he walked and counted his steps, not to pass the time but to hold on to it, because the days here did not announce themselves as there were no clear beginnings, no clean endings. Just heat that deepened and light that slanted and smoke that rose and curled through his hair until he smelled like the Velag itself. Sleep became its own fog. Nights were warm, but rarer. Like comfortable, he slept on woven mats or directly on the packed earth. Insects whispered against his skin. Sometimes he dreamed of Germany, of bells echoing through snow-heavy streets, of his mother's hands folding bread dough. Other times he dreamed of firelight and knives, of chanting he couldn't decipher once he woke with the taste of meat in his mouth, and no memory of eating the old woman he had taken to, thinking of her simply as the keeper still visited. Never with words, sometimes with fruit, sometimes just to sit beside him and rattle her gourd of seeds in a steady rhythm. It was not comforting. Viewed it was presence, and presence in a world where everyone had begun to look at him sideways was not nothing. He asked himself daily if he still wanted to live, not out of despair, but curiosity. He had been spared not once but repeatedly, first from the sea, then from the spears, then from the fire. Pith had performed, lied, invented rituals out of scraps of memory, and it had worked. But what was the endgame? How long could performance hold the weight off belief? And what if the village stopped believing? He had begun to notice small signs, a gift of food placed farther from him than before, a warrior who used tonad now passing without a glance, a child who once clung to his tunic now pull it away when he approached. Not always, not from everyone, but the shift waist there, the novelty was wearing off. Whatever story they had told themselves about the strange man who healed, who spoke to gods, who smoked beside the chief, it was beginning to fray. One afternoon, while sitting beside the river, Hans saw a boy gut a fish with astonishing precision. The boy couldn't have been more than 8. His hands moved fast, sure practiced. Blood ran in neat lines down the stone. The boy caught Hans watching, looked up, and for the first time didn't smile that night. Hans didn't eat, not because he wasn't offered anything, but because no one noticed. He hadn't been. He lay in the dark, not hungry, but hollow. The fire outside his hut had burned down. The soft red coal smoke drifted through the doorway, slow, endlessly. He closed his eyes and thought of his own name. It sounded strange in his head, now German. Syllables wrapped in smoke, soft, where once they had been sharp. He whispered it to himself like a prayer. They brought him in at dawn. There was no ceremony, no grand return of the feast that changed everything, hunters or clamor of drums. Just a soft rustling among the trees, and then the silent arrival of 4 warriors dragging the captive between them. A man, bloodied and barefoot, arms pulled behind his back so tightly, his shoulders hunched unnaturally. His face was swollen, one eye already sealed shut, but even through the bruises, hands recognized the shape of fame, the posture, the voice that broke the hush when he spoke. He was Portuguese, and not just Portuguese, a soldier from the coast. Hans had seen him before. Months ago, during a brief supply trade along the shoreline. They hadn't spoken much, just a shared not a grunt in passing, but now in this small and watching Villaga thought flicker of familiarity became a tether. The man was thrown to the center off the clearing, not cry, just carelessly, like a sack of meat that had already been priced. And then he said it, Hans, soft guttural through cracked lips. Hans froze. No one else reacted. The name meant nothing to them, just noise. But it didn't matter. The man hadn't shouted. He hadn't wept. He'd called to him as if he still believed Hans could do something. As I thought, the white man seated beside the fire, dressed like them, But not one of them could saw him. Hans stood. It was instinct more than choice. He stepped forward, heart thudding like jungle drums in his ears. For a moment his mouth opened, but the words refused to come in his mind. 1,000 language called it German, Portuguese, the fractured Tupi he'd stitched together in months often conversations, and in that collision, nothing. The old woman appeared beside him, her presence sudden and solid, like a shadow rising from stone. Her hand touched his elbow, not firmly, but meaningfully. A way to caution, don't speak. Kungam emerged. Next he didn't look at Hans. His eyes were fixed on the man at the center of the circle. With a tilt of his chin he gestured, and Thevelage moved. The fire was lit. Wood stacked carefully days before now came alive in orange breath. Smoke swirled upward into the pale morning. Hands stood still, every muscle drawn tight, eyes locked not on the fire, not on the chief, but on the man who had said his name. The captive had gone quiet. His lips moved in silent prayer. Hans could see his throat trembling with each swallow. The paint-kin next warriors painted each other's chests and cheeks. Children scattered, half curious, half afraid. The women began to hum low and breathy like wind passing through hollowed bone. Hans knew the rhythm. By now he had seen it before, but this time he was inside it, not merely a spectator. He turned away just a step, maybe two, but then Hans, no Meshi, don't leave my hands, froze. The voice was hoarse, trembling, not loud. It didn't need Tobe all around him. The village swayed in rhythm. The fire grew taller. The man wasted now, ankles to the stake, chest bare, hair matted with ash. He wasn't struggling, not yet. Hans took another step back, then another. He felt them watching, not the villagers, the children. They stood near the edge of the clearing, still as stones. Their eyes widened, dark and hollow, and in their stillness, Hans saw his reflection, not in their features, but in their gaze. They were waiting to see what he would do. Would he speak? Would he stop it? Would he claim the role he had performed for so long? But the chief never looked at him. The old woman said nothing. The dancers circled tighter, now their voices rising, faces painted into war masks of black and red. The smell of the fire was overpowering, flesh bark sweet, and Hans said nothing. He couldn't or wouldn't, or both. He walked away slowly without ceremony. He didn't run, he didn't lead, he simply turned and moved toward the shadowed edge of the village where the smoke thinned and the trees began tolling in close behind him. He heard the first blow land. The man scream met it. Wasn't a word this time, just sound, raw and involuntary, tearing through Themerning like a rip in cloth. Hans kept walking. He reached the riverbank and sat. The sounds didn't fade, not immediately. They followed him like dogs, barking and laughing and dancing in the distance, until finally they didn't. The water was still. Dragonflies skated across its surface. Somewhere upstream, a bird called downriver. Someone was washing clothes. Hans stared at his reflection in the current. The man's voice still echoed inside him, his name, spoken not by captors, not by believers, but by someone who had once stood beside him under the same sun. Someone who thought he might be more than a mask. He wasn't. He had built this cage from cleverness and cowardice. One word at a time, one prayer, one ritual, one bowl off smoke. It began with a glance, not the first time Hans had been looked at like that, but this time the eyes lingered. The hunger that looked like smiles. Woman walked past his hut at dusk, child on her hip, and smiled. Her lips curled upward, yes, but the rest of her face stayed still. Her eyes never blinked. It wasn't a smile that welcomed. It was a smile that measured. Hans shifted where he sat, his stomach cramped and empty. He hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. Not really a lump of root, some bitter paste scraped from the side of a gourd. But even if they had offered more, he wasn't sure he'd have taken it. That smile had soured his mouth. He told himself not to overthink it. The villagers often shifted in mood, some days mocking, others distant, but by nightfall he'd counted 5 others who had smiled at him, not spoken, not touched him, just passed by, turned their heads, and offered that same thin, uncanny smiley, as if they already knew something he didn't, as if a decision had been made by the next morning. The air itself felt heavier. There were no chants, no drums, just quiet kind of humming, low like breath held too long. Hans stepped outside and found a banana left at the base of his shelter, soft, overripe. It was the sort of thing a child might drop, but no one claimed it. No one. said a word he didn't touch. Instead, he wandered toward the far end of the village, to the place where the smoke drifted thickest, where fish were hung over low fires and turtle shells were blackened in ash. The men there were working, talking softly in a language Hans still barely understood, and when he passed one of them paused, he smiled that same smile. Shallow, toothy, meaningless, or worse, full of meaning. Hans didn't ask questions. He just nodded and walked away, heart thutooing against his ribs. Like it wanted out later, a boy no older than 10 crouched beside him and mimicked the sound of chewing. Slow, deliberate. Hans pretended not to notice, but the boy stayed, eyes fixed on him with eerie stillness. Then, without a word, the child reached out and placed something at Hans's feet, a small bone, clean, white, human. He didn't want to know the villagers were hungry. He could see it in their bones, ribs like branches under skin, hands thin as twigs. The drought had stretched dead longer than anyone wanted to admit. Fish were scarce, crops patchy, even the cassava looked tired, and hunger, Hans had learned, could made sacred. He had seen what happened 3 days before. A rival tribesman had been taken from the prison hut and brought to the pit, not killed immediately. No, the Tupinambá weren't butchers. They were celebrants. They painted him, danced around him, thanked him. Then they devoured him. The smell had lingered in Hans's nostrils for hours, thick and sweet like roasted pork, soaked in smoke. He dretched behind a tree and kept retching even when nothing was left inside. And now the smiling had begun. He tried not to count days, but he knew. 3 days since the last feast, 3 days since. Blood had run across the ground and into the fire pit. The timing aligned it. Always did. That evening, as the sun slumped low behind the forest, a man approached, not young, not old, eyes that looked like stone. He squatted beside Hans and spoke in halting Portuguese. 3 more nights, he Satan. He grinned. You understand? Hans didn't answer, hadn't moved. The man waited a moment, then patted him on the shoulder and walked away, lawing 3 nights. It wasn't just fear that crept in, it was a kind of unraveling, a slow fraying of self. He could feel it happening, the way his breath started coming short, the way every movement in the village snapped. His gaze toward I'd, expecting a hand on his shoulder, a knife at his neck, a command to stand up and walk to Thefire. That night, he did not sleep. The stars above the trees were sharp and cold, but he saw none of them. He sat with his back against the post legs, pulled tight to his chest, trying not to blink. Too long. Every time he did, imagined waking to a circle of painted faces, feathers bobbing, torches raised. But the night passed. No one came. Morning arrived with a strange quiet. No one greeted him. No one fed him. Not even the children came. Close he was inside of them now, a ghost they had not yet made. Then, in the afternoon, a red feather wrapper tied neatly to the doorway of his hut, knotted with thin cord. It meant something. He didn't know what, but he didn't need to. His blood knew. His skin knew. His heart answered with panic, and yet no one spoke. No one moved toward him. With ropier paint, the fire pit stayed empty. The warriors sharpened spears, but for 4 hunting, not ceremony. Still the smiles never lift. He passed a group of women weaving. One of them looked up and said something he couldn't make out. The others laughed too quickly. Then they all turned to look at him. Hans backed away slowly. That night, another prisoner was taken, an old man, hunched and limping, who had been with them longer than Hans. He was led from his corner of the village in silence. The drums began before he reached the center. Hands watched from the shadows, barely breathing. The dance was slow this time, almost reverent. The children joined at the edges, clapping in rhythm, echoing their elders. The man did not cry out, and when the blade came down, Hans felt nothing, not relief, not grief, just a hollow ache behind his eyes. They hadn't chosen him, not yet. It hadn't been mercy, it had been strategy. They wanted him to taste the waiting, to live inside the space between hunger and hope, knowing both would betray. Hyman, as he sat alone under the trees, wind stirring the feathers still tied above the fire pit, Hans understood something, would never forget. In this place, a man was eaten long before the first bite. It came to Hans not as a sudden realization, but as a quiet truth, that to be useful is to live settled into his bones like the evening mist, the kind that crawled in low, wet and inevitable. It was not hunger or fear or faith that dictated who survived in this village. It was function, purpose. Those who had it were kept, those who didn't were remembered briefly. Then recycled, he saw the rule everywhere. The blind man who wove fishing nets with fingers guided by touch alone always had people by his side. The old woman with a ruined knee who could no longer walk without leaning on a crooked stick was never short of food because she was the one who brewed the sleeping smoke and the wound ash. Even the children were not exempt, those who could mimic bird cries helped hunters find nests and track movement in the jungle. They were fed first when meat returned. Those who didn't contribute anything were spoken of less soon. They weren't spoken of at all. The rule extended even to animals. Dogs who chased off monkeys or barked at snakes were scratched behind the ears and fed scraps from the pot. But the silent, sluggish mutts, those who grew sick, grew slow, were allowed to drift into the jungle without collar or ceremony. There were no burials, no lamentations, just disappearance, and Hans, though dressed like one of them, still wore the weight of difference on his skin. His novelty had faded. His moment as a spirit-tushed figure had passed the boy. He had healed, had not died true, but he had also not been healed in any miraculous sense. He simply remained alive. That had bought Hans time, but time in this place was a currency that had to be constantly replenished, could not survive by silence. He would not survive by myth, so he began toe work. It started with his appearance. He bathed more, deliberately combed his hair with a carved stick until the tangles were gone, cut his beard shorter with the edge of a shell. When he walked past the communal fires, he did so upright, nodding when others made eye contact, stopping to observe or ask brief questions and broken tea. He stopped avoiding the gaze of children. He greeted them first. He watched how they responded, which ones lingered, which ones giggled, and more importantly, which ones stopped jiggling. Then he began the real work. The next morning he walked to the head of the old woman. She was already up sorting through roots laid out on woven mats, some thick and yellow, others twisted like dry sinew. She did not look at him, but she made space beside her. Hands knelt and began sorting with her, not speaking, only mimicking when she chewed bark and spat it into a bowl. He did the same when she crushed seeds with a round stone. He matched her rhythm. She gave no instruction, but she did not push him away. That afternoon, he went to the sick boy's hut again. The child was breathing better, though he had developed a strange cow that rasped like dry leaves underfoot. Hans felt his forehead checketh. Bowl of drink left beside him, sniffed it, then poured it out. He gathered cool leaves, layered them with mashed roots, and pressed the mix into a strip of cloth soaked in warm water. The boy's mother stared at him the whole time, saying nothing, but she didn't stop him. That night, he dreamed of the white walls of a hospital in Cologne, of his father's voice, reading aloud from a book of saints, of clean bed sheets and the smell of vinegar on bandages. He woke up before dawn and realized he'd been speaking aloud in Latin, the words still wet on his lips. Like sweet. By the next day, people had begun to come to him, not in crowds, not all at once, but steadily. A woman whose feet had been burned, walking across coals, brought her blisters to him. A boy who had fallen from a tree and cracked his shoulder came, cradling the limb in both hands. An older man with fevered eyes and ash-aching jaw was carried in by two sons, laid at Hans's feet like a bundle off kindling. Hans treated them all. He used picuses of ash and crushed mint leaves. He boiled bark in clay bowls and soaked rags in the thick steam. Hem mashed berries into paste and dabbed it across sewers. He washed wounds with salted water, dried them with dried palm fibers, tied them off with woven string. He never claimed it was magic. He stopped whispering in Latin, but people began to whisper about him again. They began to bring him things, note in gratitude, but in quiet understanding. A strip of cooked meat, wrapped in laves, a handful of dried fruit, a cup of warm broth left near his sleeping mat. One morning, a child left a string of beads at his doorway, tied in a crude loop. No one ever claimed it, even Cannibal, who rarely spoke unless necessary, began to glance toward Hans during council fires, not as a threat, not as a curiosity, but as accompanied, something integrated, something perhaps reliable. Hans worked until his fingers blistered and his back ached. At night he sat with old woman and ground herbs until his arms trembled from repetition. He no longer flinched at the smell of rotting wounds. He no longer gagged when cleaning a fevered body. He did what was needed because to be needed was to remain. He stopped asking himself who he was before he was no longer just the German, no longer the white ghost who spoke to Foray, no longer the man who had once closed his eyes while another was killed. He had no name here, only a role, and as long as he fulfilled it, he would not be forgotten. Not yet. The firelight always made it. Lies told in firelight, Yasir. It smoothed out the sharp edges of things. The scars on a man's chest, the creases around a woman's mouth, the suspicion behind a glance. Under firelight, everything flickered, everything breathed, even lies. Hans found himself talking more in the evenings, not because he wanted to deceive, but because they asked. The villagers began to gather near his hut after the heat of the day had gone. At first, it was just a few: the boy with the burned feet, the girl whose brother had died last season, one of the younger warriors who asked too many questions. Then others followed. They didn't always speak. Sometimes they just watched him prepare medicines, watched him crush bark and mix pastes as if his fingers were telling stories, even when his mouth was silent. Then one night they asked him where he had come from, not in the language of trade or ritual, just a child's question: where is he, our sky? Hans didn't know how to answer, so he told Astri. He spoke in slow, broken Tupi, seasoning it with gestures and expression. He pointed up to the stars, traced lines with his finger like constellations, told them about a land where the trees were short and the ground froze in winter, where water turned hard and witten fell from the sky like feathers. He told them of mountains so large they touched the clouds, of buildings made of stone, stacked upon stone, of bells that rang in towers taller than any tree. The children listened with wide eyes, the adults listened too, though more carefully. Hans saw in their faces not wonder, but measurement, weighing the truth, not of his words, but of his voice, whether he meant what he said, whether he believed it, whether they could afford to. And that was the moment he realized the truth no longer mattered, only utility did. So he gave them stories, some real, some warped, some wholly invented. A tally of men sailing on frozen rivers, a legend of a bird so large it carried off goats, a memory of a field of red flowers that bloomed only when a king was buried. They weren't lies meant to deceive, they were at least meant to feed, because stories, like herbs, had their uses. They softened fear, they distracted, they gathered people into a circle, and in circles no one was left outside, not even him. One night a warrior asked him if heckled speak to the stars. Hans almost laughed, but instead he looked up, furrowed his brow, and said nothing. Silence can be more powerful than a yes. From that point on they began asking him for signs, not openly, not like the first time when he had cured the boy with ritual and fire speech. These requests were softer, folded into question: should we go west tomorrow? The animals have been quiet. Will the rains return this week? The air is heavy. Can you see anything in the coals? Heinz never answered directly, but he learned the rhythm. Would close his eyes, breathe deeply, and say what felt safe, or what felt helpful, or what he thought they already hoped to hear. He no longer feared being found out, because what was there to find? They knew he was not one of them. They had always known, but they still came. They still asked, because even a foreign spirit, even a broken vessel of godless knowledge, was better than silence in a world full of uncertainty. And Hans, who had once clung to the idea that he was only pretending, began to believe in his own usefulness. He started watching the clouds, not for omens, but for wind shifts and moisture. He paid attention to the ants, to the frogs, to the way birds took flight in the morning. He listened to how the old woman spoke to her herbs before grinding them, how the hunters used sound instead of sight to know if the jaguar had passed. He gathered every observation, like a fisherman casting his net widened. Then when asked for guidance, he gave it, dressed in silence and gravity. It wasn't prophecy, it was performance woven with attention, and it worked. A woman whose child had been sick returned to him with smoked fish and anaclace of shells. A man who had taken Hans's advice on where to hunt came back with 3 birds and a smile. Fatsaid, you are part of this now. Even the chief's glances held a different weight, less skepticism, more expectation. That was what frightened Hans most, not that he would be exposed, but that he wouldn't be able to stop. He no longer knew which gestures were play and which had become real. When he touched someone's shoulder, was it reassurance or ritual? When he traced circles in the dirt to describe a coming storm, was it science or superstition? He began to wonder if there was even a line anymore, or if he had crossed it so long ago that the path back had vanished. Some nights he lit his own fire and sat alone far from the others. You will draw the symbols they used in their chants into the earth, and then erase them. Then he would draw crosses, then wipe those away too. He didn't pray. He didn't know who to pray to anymore, but he did speak to the fire, to the jungle, to the bones that still lay buried beneath the cooking pits. He whispered promises, not for redemption, not for rescue, just for time, because time was the one thing still moving, and he had learned to keep pace with it. Even when he no longer recognized the man doing the walking, he never meant to forget the shape of the man who dreamed of Europe bread, but it slipped away slowly, one memory at a time. At first, it had still come to him easily, the golden crust, the way steam coiled upward when broken, the slight crunch before softness, the warm weight of it in his hands. He could close high size, and there it was, sitting on the wooden table in his mother's kitchen side. The thick pot of butter and the chipped bowl of salt. There had always been bread in Germany, even in lean times, flatbread, round bread stuffed with onion or cheese, dense rye that sat heavy in the stomach and warm in the chest. Now he could barely remember the taste. It wasn't that he hadn't tried to recall it on long nights lying on woven mats while the jungle throbbed with sound. He'd force himself to summon the details, texture, smell, even the weight of flour on his fingers. But something about the damp heat of this place, a booth ceaseless rhythm of insect wings and chanting voices, dulled those memories. They blurred like ink in the rain, and the harder he tried to retrieve them, the more distant they felt, like Simeon Eales's life recounted in a storybook, left out in the sun too long. He began to wonder what else he had forgotten: the faces of his siblings, his mother's voice, the exact slope of the street where the baker's shop sat once. While working beside the old woman, he found himself humming under his breath some tune from his childhood, simple and circular, and realized he couldn't remember the words. He couldn't even recall if it had been a hymn or a lullaby, and that frightened him more than any spear ever had. It made him feel like a house losing bricks, quietly collapsing from the inside, unnoticed by those who passed it each day. During the day he played his role, he collected herbs, applied pasts, gave answers and riddles that passed for wisdom. But at night he lay awake and dreamed of Europe, not the one he had lived in, not the cold docks of Lisbon or the miserable military camps, but the Europe he had carried with him like a talisman across the ocean, a Europe of stained glass and iron bells, of warm ovens and crisp linen sheets, a Europe that had perhaps never existed in full, but which now in his isolation had become sacred in its incompleteness. He saw snow in his dreams, thick, falling, silent. He saw rooftops buried in white trees, shivering under icicles, the sky so pale it looked like porcelain. In one dream he stood barefoot in it and felt the sting of cold rise through his heels and into his lungs. He gasped, not in pain but in gratitude. When he woke he was sweating. Heat clung to him like a fever. One morning a child brought him a gift, a carved figure made of clay and riverstone. It had long arms, a blank face and a wide mouth. The boy told him it was a spirit, one that protected men who had no home. Hans thanked him. He turned the figure over in his hand and noticed how smooth the back had been worn. Someone had held it often. Someone else had. Hans believed in it. He placed it on a shelf above his mat and left it there, not as a token of faith, but as a marker that was the thing about living. In a place like this, you began to measure your existence in objects, in gestures, in the tiny details that anchored you to the present. The figure became one such anchor. So did the pouch of ground herbs he carried with him. The gourd, with its hairline, cracked. The familiar creak of the reed mat beneath his knees when he stood. His identity was no longer held in language and nationality, in prayer smuttered under his breath. It lived in movement. He had become the way he knelt beside a sick child, the way he stirred paste with 3 fingers, instead of 12 way he paused before answering a question, not to translate words, but to his belief, and still at the edges of it all. The dream of Europe persisted, fainter but not gone. Sometimes when the sun hit the river just right and the steam rose from the jungle like chimney smoke, He would close his eyes and pretend it was mist curling from a snowy hill. Sometimes he would watch the villagers lay dough over hot stones and pretend it was a hearth. Not a fire pit. He never told them these things. They would not have understood. They had never seen. Snow never smelled yeast. Rising never knelt on stone in a church where Latin echoed like thunder, and a priest raised his hands beneath painted ceilings. They had no words for nostalgia, only words for hunger, for healing porcelains. So Hans carried those memories alone like stones in his pocket, heavy smoothed by time, waiting for the river to carry them away. He did not cry. Crying had dried up long ago. Somewhere between the day he saw the man scream his name and the night he lied by firelight and was thanked for it, but there was something beneath his ribs that acted in place of tears, something too soft for survival and too old for hope still. He did not stop dreaming, because in the dreaming he remained human, and in a place where the line between man and spirit blurred daily. That was perhaps the most important act of resistance he had left. They called him to the circle before the sun had touched the treetops, the dance that ended in silenceto. One shouted, no one dragged him, the ropes were gone. Instead, two painted men simply stood outside. His shelter arms crossed faces, unreadable beneath layers of soot and red dye. One tapped a rhythm on a hollowed gourd, the other gestured in slowly toward the village square. Hans stepped forward. His feet were unsteady, not because they had bound him again. This time they hadn't, but because of silence. It was not the silence of peace or reverence, it was the silence that came before something final. He had seen it once before, that same hush, the same still air too, quiet for birdsong, the same careful gathering of the villagers like branches being laid for a pea. It was the silence that had come just before the man named Miguel, a fellow prisoner, was marched to the stake this time. The silence had shape, and it danced. The villagers had already formed the outer circle. They were painted again more vividly than before, chevrons of black, rings of white, blood-cold spirals that ran across shoulders and throats. Their bodies shimmered with oil and sweat, feathers and beads. Stitched tosk in a slow drum beat echoed from the center. Thump, pause, thump, and then the dancers began to move. Hans was pulled into the center, not with force, but with ceremony. One of the old women came to him with a bundle of feathers and a pot of dye. She did not speak. She daubed red across his chest, smeared black beneath his eyes. Another woman pressed beads into his palms, then tied thin cords of plant fiber around his biceps. A boy no older than 10 tied a single white feather into his bound hair. He stood like a painted puppet. Then the chief raised his hand, the drums quickened, and Hans danced. He did not know the steps, but others joined him, 2 warriors circling, guiding him, mimicking movements until he followed his arms, lifted his knees, bent his feet, struck the earth around him. The whole village spun, children laughing, women swaying, old men stamping in rhythm, but none of them looked at him directly. Their eyes passed over him like wind through leaves, present and yet distant. He moved until he no longer knew what time it was, until the sweat ran into his eyes and the paint on his skin turned to mud, until his legs trembled, not from fear, Butexhauschen. Then came the fire. They lit it not in the center, but just outside the ring of dancers, a wide, hungry blaze. The flames spat sparks into the air like furious insects. Shadows stretched across the faces of the villagers, turning their painted marks into demons' masks. The drums stopped. Everyone froze. A man was brought forward. Hans did not recognize him. He was not one of the Europeans, a stranger, maybe from Anno Thurtrib. He was stripped to the waist, hands bound, face blank. No struggling, nobbing. His eyes flicked toward the fire, then back to the crowd, then to Hans, and held only for a moment, but it felt like a thread pulled tight across Hans's chest. Then they took him to the post. What followed Hans didn't, remembering full. He remembered the smell, first burned hair, cooked skin, then the screams, then the drums again, loud and fast, trying to outpace the dying sounds. Furiers danced harder, striking their feet like thunder. The women keened. The chief raised his arms and howled, but Hans, he couldn't move. He stood in the same spot, feet planted like roots. His painted body no longer felt like his own. It felt like a costume someone else had forced onto a corpse. And then, without signal, the drumming stopped. The fire crackled, but no one moved, not even the smoke. It was as if time had snapped enough. The warriors still crouched mid-step, blinked slowly. A child clung to his mother's skirt. Eyes wide and face smeared with red, the chief exhaled through his nose and lowered his arms, and everyone turned away. Just like that the feast would come later, the silence now was for Staden. Hans walked away. Without being told, he wandered toward the edge of the forest, past the empty huts and the hanging nets. His legs moved, but he felt nothing, no relief, no terror, no joy at surviving, just nothing. The man who had burned was not him. That's what he told himself. He had worn the feathers, mimicked the steps, felt the flames, but he had not died. The other man had. And yet as he sat beneath the twisted tree, near the stream, wiping the mud from his chest, Hans realized something had shifted. The fear was still there, but deeper, now not loud like before. Not the frantic terror of being chosen, but a dull weight wedged into his ribs, a knowledge he could not discard. Next time, it might be him, or worse, next time it might not matter, because tonight something had broken, not in the tribe, not in the ceremony, but in him and the real horror. He wasn't even sure if he wanted it fixed by the 9th month. Hans had stopped hoping for anything, and then the sea returned. Silence. It started as a smudge on the horizon. Hans was ankle deep in the estuary, helping one of the elders retrieve a drifted fish trap, when the child screamed, not out of fear, wonder, high-pitched, sharp, and filled with the kind of terror that came from awe, not pain. Others looked up, one pointed, another ran. Then the whole shore sea meadow shift nets. Forgotten baskets dropped, then all faces turned eastward. Out there, far beyond the last sandbank, a triangular sail bobbed slowly into view. Hans's breath caught. It was not a canoe, not a bird. It was not a mirage caused by heat or hunger. It was a European ship. His heart struck his ribs like a drum. Not a single word made it to his mouth for a moment. He just stood there, dripping water, watching the outline grow crisper. Square sails, a wooden hull, Portuguese, almost certainly a merchant ship or a military cutter. It didn't matter, it was from his world, and it had come. He ran, sand kicked up behind him as he bolted up the beach. Past startled villagers, past racks of drying meat, past the painted skulls on sticks that marked sacred places. He tore off his tunic and began waving it, arms wild, eyes wide. He screamed in Portuguese and German, even Latin, anything that might carry his voice. Cracked when no one responded. He dropped to his knees and began to write in the sand with both hands. Hanston, alive, prisoner, save. God help me. Letters scratched by desperation. He rewrote them larger. Then he took palm fronds and arranged them in shapes. Across an arrow pointing inland, he lit asmal fire and fed it leaves to create smoke, and still the ship did not turn behind him. Villagers watched in silence. Some whispered, some backed away. One child laughed nervously. They had seen him behave oddly before, but never like this to them. He looked possessed, or was like a man calling to something forbidden. Old men muttered that he was summoning sea ghosts. One of the women threw ashes into the tide. Another spat at the sand, and Kund himself stood near the forest line, arms crossed, saying nothing, but watching. That night, Hans did not sleep, sat near the shore, wrapped in a thin hide, his body tight as a wire, his eyes never leaving the horizon. Lanterns flickered on the ship. Once he thought he saw a figure at the bow, but it was too far. No calls reached him, no reply came, and the tide erased his words. The next morning the ship remained anchored, but distant like a god, unsure of where to land. Whispers spread quickly among the villagers. Some believed it was a floating spirit, a divine envoy. Others said it was a trap. A few thought the ship had brought sickness. Children were kept inside huts. Offerings were placed at the edge of the tide. Fish heads, feathers, carved stones. Hands tried again. This time he climbed a dead tree near the water's edge and broke several branches to signal attention. He took charcoal and painted his arms with crosses. When the ship didn't move, he built a second fire, a tall one, feeding it with oil from crushed seeds, creating black smoke that curled up like a question. Still nothing. The child approached him later with a piece of driftwood shaped like a boat and held it out, then pointed to the sea. Hans didn't know if it was mockery or sympathy. By the second night, Hans had grown hoarse. He had cried, begged, even whispered psalms. He had drawn maps in the sand, traced the German alphabet with a stick. He had screamed for mercy, for rescue, for any sign, and the ship just waited as if it were listening or forgetting the villagers. Had stopped approaching even those who liked him. The old woman, with a toothless smile. The boy who brought him berries now avoided his gaze. His rations shrank. No one asked him to help with firewood or fish. He had become other again. The fire he lit on the third night burned low and cold. He wondered if the crew had seen him and turned away. Maybe they thought him mad or savage or already dead. Maybe the fear of the cannibal coast had outmatched their curiosity. Hans sat with his back to the sea and his face to Thefrest. He whispered in German to himself, not a prayer, just words. Mutter vad brought Galaka Kara a band zoo. He heard his voice break on the last in zoo house home, and then with no warning the sound of oars. He turned a longboat. Portuguese men coming ashore, and something broke inside him. Relief, terror, and a final flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, someone had seen the desperate scratches in the Sansamian, had heard a voice that still believed rescue was possible. But even in that moment of revelation, Hans could not stand. His legs trembled under him, not just from exhaustion, but from disbelief. He crawled to the edge of the tide, hands sinking into wet sand. Have imagined this so many times. Imagined that someone would come, that a sail would bloom against the sky like a white lily, that oars would churn through this brackish water and deliver him from the jaws of ritual death. But he had also imagined it would feel different. He had imagined joy, and yet now there was on-life fear. What if they didn't recognize him? What if they feared the man he had become, half-naked, wild-haired, tattooed insuit, and soothed by jungle firelight? What if they mistook him for one of them, or worse, what if they demanded proof of who he was, and he had none? No seal, no papers, no rank, only scars and memorias. What if the sea had already swallowed the version of him? They might trust. The longboat moved closer. No hands could see them clearly. Muskets slung at their backs, bronze skin from sun and salt. One wore a red sash around his waist. Another, tall, square-jawed, stood at the bow with narrowed, ice-yerking, measuring hand, stood swaying. He puffed his hands around Hismith and shouted again. His voice cracked. His throat was raw, but this time he saw one of the men freeze. He saw lips move, a pause. Then a hand lifted, hesitant, answered, and waved back. He collapsed, not from joy, not yet, but from the strange, unbearable release of months' worth of taut wire snapping all at once, the agony of tension dissolving. Hell out, a broken, sputtering thing, and the sound frightened even the birds behind him. The villagers remained in their half-circle. They had not approached the beach. Some clutched charms. One woman had smeared red dye across her eyes. They said nothing. They made no move to stop him. But they did not look away either, and Hans knew in the strange stillness between wave and shore that he was no longer theirs, nor was he yet returned to Thule. He had lost. He was for this one moment suspended, caught in the tide between two countries, two selves and two sets of gods. The oars dipped in the stranger who spoke his Nemesilence. Each pull of wood against water seemed louder than it should have, amplified by the hush that fell over the shoreline. Even the birds had quieted. Only the surf whispered, folding and refolding itself into the sand, like a priest's sleeve hiding something sacred. Hands didn't move. He couldn't. His feet had sunk slightly into the wet edge of the tide, as though the earth itself had taken hold of him, unsure whether to give him up or claim him for good. He watched as the longboat scraped onto the beach, the prow groaning as it touched land for the first time in days, or perhaps weeks. Its sailors leapt out quickly, practiced and alert, weapons slung, boots crunching on shell and grit. Their eyes swept the tree-line. First one man raised a hand, slowly signaling to a lookout. Still on the ship, hands stood there, shirtless, face stir, with a Sean salt heart pounding in a rhythm that had not been his own in a long, long time. One of the men stepped forward, older, thick beard, flecked with white, his uniform, if it could still be called, that was faded but still bore the buttons of Portuguese command. He scanned Hans up and down, eyes narrowing, and then he said it. The Hans, just the one word, no title, no context. Just the name suspended in the air, like smoke from a wet fire. Hans blinked, his tongue was stuck, his mind raced. The man spoke again. Hanston from Hesse. Hans nodded once. The strength in his legs returned in a rush, and nearly buckled him to the ground. The stranger's face changed some mixture of disbelief, relief, and sorrow, then turned and gestured to the men behind him. One of them stepped forward and handed him a small wrapped bundle, something like dried meat wrapped in cloth. The man extended it toward Hans. "You look like death," he said softly. "Eat." Hans took it, but his hands trembled so violently that the bundle fell to the sand. One of the Portuguese sailors bent to retrieve it and pressed it into Hans's chest with gentle insistence. Only after the first bite did Hans realize how badly he had been starving, not just for food, for words, for names, for the sound of someone saying his name, as if it meant something again. "Do you remember me?" The menaced hands squinted, frowning, and then, as if tugged from a dream, the memory came. The docks at Bissau years ago, a storm aspilled barrel, a curse shouted across the deck for no. Hans whispered. The man smiled. "Yes, I was a junior pilot. You once loaned me a knife." Hans gave a weak laugh. "You never gave it back." Ferno chuckled. "And I still have it for a moment." It was almost like standing in Lisbon again, almost until the wind shifted, and behind them the jungle murmured like a living thing, and the smell of fish and smoke brought Hans back. The other sailors were not smiling. They watched the tree, eyeing wearily. One had already raised his musket, just in case, but the forest remained still. The village behind Hans had not moved. No shouting, no running, no spears. Just silence. "Watching. Does the chief know?" Fernost. Hans shook his head. "He watched. He didn't stop me." "But he didn't bless it either." Ferno nodded grimly. Then he reached into a leather pouch on his belt and drew out a small sack. Inside was something heavy, gold or salt or cloth. Hans's couldn't see. "It won't be official," Ferno said, his voice low, "but it'll be now." Hans blinked. "You came to buy me?" Fnon didn't flinch. "No, I came to pay. Spirits that own you, that's how they see it. You're not just a man, you're a life debt. You're theirs in story and in blood. I'm not buying a friend, I'm balancing the scale." Hans stared at Thesak. "Will it work?" "It has to." Ferno said, "I've traded with these people before. I know their chiefs. I've left rum, knives, beads. But this time I brought the one thing they value most." Hans frowned. Ferno looked him in the eye. As there was a pause, Fernan turned to his men. "Stay here, wait for the signal." Then to Hans, "Walk with me." Together they approached the edge of the village. Kanya stood waiting, flanked by two elders. His eyes did not move to Thegold. He looked at Hans, at Ferno, at the way they walked together. One filthy barefoot, still draped in the dust of captivity. The other neat, upright, smelling of oil and rope and civilization. Then the chief turned and walked back into Thekries. Without a word, Fern glanced at Hans. "That's not Anno." Hans exhaled slowly. Maybe, just maybe, the sea had come for him after all, but its price had not yet been paid. It was the next, the farewell with no words. Morning. Hans didn't sleep that night. Neither did Ferno. They sat near the Ferotaga, their backs to the village and eyes to the ship, their conversation sparse. Ferno had offered him a wool blanket. Hans had refused after so many months, sleeping under palm thatch and smoke. The tight weave felt wrong, too clean, too square, too European. He let it lie in hislop, like something borrowed from a play he no longer understood. No one came for him that night. No voice summoned him to the chief's hut. No hand pulled him away. But when dawn bled into the sky like bruised light, one of the younger men approached, said nothing, only pointed to the shore. The longboat was already there, pulled halfway onto Thiessen. Hans stood. His knees didn't tremble this time. They simply obeyed. His body moved on memory. Alone, mechanical, silent, reverent, in a way he didn't recognize. He didn't ask if it was time. He didn't need to. The stillness of Thier had already told him. Yes, Gopher, and was already at the boat. The crew had stowed supplies. They were ready. Hans turned slowly and looked back. One last time at the village. No one waited at the edge. Offices peered from the huts, but he knew they were watching through slats behind leaves, under mats of woven fiber, watching to see if you would cry, if you would run, if you would betray the strange balance he had become part of. He didn't cry, but his eyes searched for one face, the child, the boy who had followed him in silence for so many weeks, imitating his walk, copying his gesture, sitting nearby but never speaking. The one who had once handed him a carved fish and walked away before Hans could ask his name, and there he was, not by the hut's knot, Near the path, but standing alone by the drying racks where smoke strips of meat curled in the rising sun, the boy stood straight, arms at his sides. His hair had been oiled that morning, his face was clean, but had not smiled, hence raised his hand. The boy did not raise his back, only watched a long pause stretched between them, longer than any prayer Hans had ever known. Then Hans lowered his arm and turned away. Each step toward the boat felt like a theft, not just of himself, but of everything. He could not explain, could not carry the smell of river fish, the rhythm of chance at dusk, the way a gourd felt in his hand full of water, or meaning, or both these things did not belong to him. They never had, but now walking away, he felt their weight pressed behind his ribs. He climbed into the boat. Ferno offered a hand, but Hans waved it off-gently. He sat at the bow. The wood was warm from the sun. Already it creaked under his shift of weight. No drums marked his departure. No words were spoken, not by the tribe, not by the sailors, not even by Hans himself. Oars moved, the boat slid back into the sea, and the shore with its spears and smoke and salt-stained skulls began to shrink. Hans did not look back. He looked forward toward the larger ship, toward the sails, toward a future that smelled of bread and ink and linen, a future that might not want him any more than the jungle had, but it would take him, and that for now was a no. The boy never moved, not even when the boat became a speck in the distance sea. Just stood there silent, still not angry, not so, just watching. The scent hit him before the ship even Europe smelled like bread. It drifted across the harbor of Lisbon, like a memory, faint but distinct, warm, yeasty, almost sweet bread, not the kind scorched on rocks or baked over coals, wrapped in leaves, real bread, oven bread, wheat and fire, and something else Hans hadn't smelled in what felt like centuries. Safety, it undid him. He stood at thrilling hands, gripping the edge until his knuckles widened. His mouth didn't open, his eyes didn't blink, but something inside him cracked. A dry, soundless shatter. Had imagined this moment more times than he could count, reuniting with old comrades, writing letters home, maybe even standing before princes and priests to tell his story, but none of those imaginings had included this: the smell off bread, or the sharp blue sky, or the way people on the dock shouted but did not look behind them, as if time only moved forward here, or the women with veils stepping lightly as if nothing dirty had ever touched their feet, or the smooth stone underfoot swept and polished too pale to be real. Ferno clapped a hand on his shoulder. "We're home." Hans nodded, but inside he whispered, "No, I don't live here anymore." They disembarked. A man in a crisp uniform barked questions in Portuguese, and Ferno answered. Hans did not speak. He kept his gaze low. His clothes, borrowed from the sailors, felt like someone else's skin. His hair had been trimmed roughly with a knife. He had bathed in salt water and been scrubbed with vinegar. Still, he could feel the jungle on him. In him, every step left a mark. They gave him lodging in a small room above a bakery. The smell of crusty loaves seeped into the floorboards. On the first night, the baker's wife brought them a slice still warm with honey and butter. Hans took it with both hands, hebbed into it slowly, deliberately, and then hewed, not loudly, not brokenly, just tears falling straight down, without effort, without warning, the kind of weeping that had no beginning and no end. The kind that simply was like breath, like hunger, like grief. He didn't leave the room for 3 days. Fern came once, left a pouch of coins on the table, and said nothing else. Hans nodded. He would repay him one day, maybe, when he finally ventured outside. It world felt wrong. Too many straight lines, too many rectangles. The windows had glass, and they closed completely. People bowed at the cathedral, but not to each other. No one touched the ground with reverence. No one watched the wind. Everything moved fast, efficient, proud. But no one watched. Hans walked among them like a ghost. No one recognized him. A few noticed the scars on his arms, the sun-bleached look of his skin, the wildness still faint in his gait, but no one asked. Perhaps they thought him a sailor gone mad, a vagrant, a missionary failed, but he was not mad. He was displaced. He visited the church once. He sat in the back pew and listened to the priest chant in Latin. The rhythm was familiar. The candles still flickered like they did in his youth, but the words no longer fit. They echoed, too cold, too far, too high. He left before the sermon ended in the market. He passed a stall of carved figurines, saints, soldiers, kings. He picked one up, a knight with a sword. A cross on his chest. The seller smiled. "It's fine wood," he said. "German just like you." Hans blinked. He didn't remember saying where he was from. He bought nothing that evening. A group of children played in the alley. One of them had a toy boat carved from cork. Another wore a feather tucked into his cap. They laughed in quick bursts. Running barefoot across cobbles, Hans watched, and then from somewhere inside himself he said the words aloud. It was not all savagery. He wasn't sure who he was speaking to, maybe to God, maybe to himself, maybe to Thuan, because the truth, the one no one here would want, was that the jungle had answered him more than any chapel. Thirth had listened, the people had watched, the spirits had whispered, and here there was only noise, only bread and bells and silence dressed in civilitiso. He returned to his room, and for the next few weeks he spoke to Noah, book against time, and Tithon. He began writing, because the dreams wouldn't stop. Each night, Hans would lie in the narrow cot above the bakery, and the darkness would open. Like a mouth he'd hear the hum of insects, the crackle of fires, the steady beat of wooden drums far away but insistent like a second pulse under his skin. He'd see faces, not of enemies, but of people. A woman rubbing gash across a wound, a boy imitating his walk, a man breathing his last into Hans's hands while no prayers came. He feared forgetting them, but he feared more what others might say in his place, and so he wrote by candlelight day after day. Ink staining his fingers, he shaped the memory into something tangible. It wasn't just a journal, it wasn't just a tale of survival, it was testimony. Worn in remembrance, each line was a tether to the months he had spent suspended between death and life, between faith and sullency. When the book was finished, it bore the long name, but most would know it simply as the true history of Hans Staden. It was published in 1557. It spread quickly, first in German-speaking lands, then into Latin, French, and beyond. People read it in awe. Some doubted, some marveled, some wept, but none could look away. It became more than a book. It became a mirror held up to both European, the world it claimed to civilize, and Hans. He never returned to the jungle, but never quite left it either until his death in 1576. He would walk past bread stalls and think of smoke. He would hear hymns and remember feathers curling in fire. He would close his eyes and still see waves washing away his name in the sand. But his story remained, not just his story. There's all of theirs. So here, where the waves have stilled, the jungle has grown quiet, and Hans, just Hans, is home. Though what home means is no longer so simple. He made it back to bread and bells, to stone churches and clean linens. But not all of him returned. Some part remained out there in the tangled green hush of Brazil, where death sat close and yet life spoke louder. And maybe that's the part of the story that lingers. Not the cannibals, not the escape, but the listening, the realization that survival is sometimes less about strength and more about paying attention to silence, to kindness, to the lives of others, even when they don't speak your language. If you're still here, still listening, thank you. That means the world, this little corner of the internet, exists for stories like this, for people like you, people who know that history isn't always made of kings and wars. Sometimes it's one man holding his breath on a strange beach, hoping someone will recognize his name. If this story made you feel something, sadness, wonder, stillness, and you'd like to hear more, you're always welcome back. You can leave us a thought below, or just rest. That's enough too. Wherever you are, whatever the night brings, sleep softly, and we'll see you again soon.